going to talk about constraints of the government bureaucracy, which are a little bit different, or actually a lot different than what we see in private organizations. Um, we already know that it's very difficult to fire a government employee or someone who works for the civil service. But you cannot hire anyone, fire anyone, build anything, or sell anything that involves the government without going through the procedures that are set down in law. Salaries are set, goals of the agencies are set, procedures, these are all set by Congress. And so I've given you a couple of examples here. The Soil Conservation Service required to employ at least 14,177 full-time workers. Agency for International Development, they have to send Congress 288 reports each year. The Department of Defense must give a fair portion of its contracts to small businesses operated by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, and they have to buy from American firms, even if that means paying more than something that was made in another country. On page 395 of your textbook, it gives a little information about the Freedom of Information Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Privacy Act. We're going to actually work on those together, so I'm not going to go over those on here. But the biggest constraint, or what slows the process down, is Congress rarely gives any job to a single agency. So remember, all of these have different procedures and goals. So the example your textbook gives, or one of them, is drug trafficking. And so Customs Service deals with this, FBI, the DEA, Border Patrol, and the Defense Department. So once again, all of them have different goals, have different procedures, and so it just can be a nightmare getting through that. So some of the effects of these constraints that are put on people who are trying to work with the government or get anything done in the government often acts very slowly. The more constraints, the longer it takes to get anything done. Sometimes they'll act inconsistently when we start looking at the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act. Well, on one hand, you're saying we have the freedom to get information, but on the other hand, we're protecting people's privacy. So this is definitely inconsistent. Easier to block action than it is to take action. You have all of these voices, and the more voices you have, they start to cancel each other out. Lower-ranking employees will be reluctant to make decisions on their own. If there are a lot of constraints, if you mess up, you're going to get in trouble. So just these lower-level employees, to avoid getting in trouble, just let the boss make the decisions, where if you're in a private business, there's not, these things are law. So in private businesses, they're more policies, not necessarily laws set down by Congress. Citizens complain about red tape, all the paperwork, all the regulations, procedures, and all that. So the more constraints to serve, the more forms to fill out, and it just gets entirely to the point where people just say, I give up. Complicated political environment makes the process clumsy, not incompetent. So a lot of times we will, people will say that, these government employees are incompetent and they don't know what they're doing, but it really is the process and not the employees that are incompetent. And why so many constraints? The constraints come from the demands of influential factions. So civil rights groups want hiring and buying from minority groups, so they push Congress to make rules like the one that we talked about for the Department of Defense. If you're going to buy something, it has to be American-made, and you have to give equal contracts to minority businesses. Environmental groups want environmental impact statements. Anything that government does, they have to do an impact statement to see how is this going to affect the environment. You have industry and businesses versus labor unions. So they all have things to put in, or want things put in to help them. And to get rid of these constraints, it would require Congress, the courts, and the White House to start repealing those constraints. And everybody wants to keep theirs but get rid of someone else's. So that's why there are so many.